The slave ships came down from the black sky like metal insects, hungry for flesh and blood and screaming souls across 1,000 worlds. They descended, and from each world, they took the weak and the strange and the unlucky, and they packed them into cages that smelled of fear and old death, and they carried them away to a place where hope went to die. This was the way of the Kethvari Dominion, and this had been their way for 4,000 years, and no one had ever stopped them because no one had ever been strong enough to try. The ships belonged to the Crucible of Vexaner, which was not a place, but a legend, and not a legend, but a nightmare made real from stone and blood and ancient technology that had watched billions die for the entertainment of creatures who had forgotten what mercy meant. Arena Master Zolthrax stood at the center of his observation deck and watched the harvest reports scroll across his screens, and he felt something that might have been satisfaction. If his species had been capable of such an emotion, he was tall and terrible to look upon, with a body like a praying mantis grown to the size of a small vehicle, and compound eyes that reflected light in ways that made other species feel like they were being watched by 1,000 judges at once. His 4 manipulator arms moved across the control panels with the grace of a musician playing an instrument made of suffering, and his mandibles clicked together in what his subordinates had learned to recognize as contentment. Report, he said, and his voice was like stones grinding together in a deep cave. His lieutenant was a smaller creature of the same species, and she bowed low before speaking, because that was what you did when you served the arena master and wanted to keep your head attached to your body. We have collected specimens from 47 worlds, she said, and her voice trembled only a little, which was impressive given how many lieutenants had been fed to the arena beasts for delivering bad news. The quotas have been met and exceeded, and we have several specimens of particular interest. Zolthrax turned one segment of his compound eyes toward her, while the rest continued scanning the reports. Show me. The screen flickered and images began to appear from a frozen moon made of methane and ice. They had taken a being made of living crystal who could sing in frequencies that shattered stone, but who would crack like glass if struck with sufficient force, from a garden world covered in flowers and gentle creatures. They had taken a telepath who could read minds and broadcast emotions, but who had never in her life raised a hand in violence, and who wept at the thought of causing pain to any living thing. From the floating cities of a gas giant, they had taken a being of living plasma who burned with the heat of a small star, but who needed a special containment suit to survive, and who would dissipate into nothing if that suit was breached. Each specimen was catalogued and evaluated, and given a number that represented their expected entertainment value and their projected survival time, which was measured in seconds because no one survived the Crucible of Vexaner for longer than that. Then, the screen showed something that made Zolthrax pause. What is this? He asked, and his voice had changed in a way that made his lieutenant take an involuntary step backward. A specimen from a planet called Earth, she said, and she consulted her datapad with hands that were now definitely shaking. It is classified as Deathworld Category 7. Zolthrax went very still in the classification system used by the Dominion. A Deathworld Category 1 was a planet with slightly higher than average dangers, and a Deathworld Category 5 was a planet that most species would consider completely uninhabitable. No one talked about Category 6 because planets that dangerous were usually just sterilized from orbit, and forgotten about. Category 7 was supposed to be theoretical. You are telling me, Zolthrax said slowly and carefully, because he wanted to make sure he understood correctly before he decided whether to kill his lieutenant or promote her, that your harvesters went to a Category 7 world and came back alive. They lost 60% of the crew, his lieutenant admitted, and this was the part she had been dreading, because 60% casualties on a harvesting run was the kind of number that ended careers and sometimes lives. But they brought back a specimen, and the specimen is intact and apparently healthy. The image on the screen showed a creature that looked Remarkably unremarkable, it was bipedal and stood about average height for a sentient species, and it had 2 arms and 2 legs, and a head with 2 eyes and a mouth, and it was covered in brown skin and black hair, and it wore the simple prisoner garments that all specimens were given it. Was a female of its species, and according to the file her name was Kira Okonkwo, and she had been something called a search and rescue specialist in a place called Lagos before the harvesters had taken her. She did not look dangerous. She did not look special. She looked like the kind of specimen that would die in the first 3 seconds of round 1 and be forgotten before. Her body had finished falling to the ground, but something about her made. Zolthrax leaned closer to the screen in the image. She was sitting in her cell, and she was not crying, and she was not screaming, and she was not curled up in a ball of despair. Like most specimens did when they first arrived, she was doing something with her body that the computer identified as push-ups, which was apparently a form of physical conditioning that humans engaged in voluntarily for reasons that the Dominions scientists could not quite understand, and she was looking around her cell with eyes that were not filled with fear, but with something else. Something that looked almost like curiosity, interesting. Zolthrax said, and he made the clicking sound that meant he was amused, though it could also mean he was about to order someone's execution. So his lieutenant remained appropriately terrified. "Tell me more about this Deathworld." His lieutenant pulled up the file on Earth and began to read, and as she read, her voice grew more and more uncertain because the data did not make sense. Earth was a planet where the water fell from the sky in sheets that could drown the unwary and froze into solid form that could trap and kill, and evaporated into nothing during seasons of heat that would cook most species alive. It was a planet where the ground shook without warning and swallowed cities whole, and where mountains exploded and buried entire regions under molten rock, and where the very air could spin itself into funnels of destruction that tore apart everything they touched. It was a planet where 70% of the surface was covered in water that contained predators with hundreds of teeth and tentacles that could crush metal and poisons that could kill in seconds. Was a planet where the land was home to creatures that hunted in packs, and creatures that ambushed from hiding, and creatures so large they could crush a transport vehicle under 1 foot. The humans were the most terrifying thing of all. They were persistence predators, which meant they did not hunt by being fast or strong or venomous, but by simply refusing to stop. They would chase their prey for hours or days or weeks, and they would not give up, and they would not get tired, and eventually their prey would collapse from exhaustion, and the humans would walk up to it and kill it while it lay there too tired to run anymore. They had survived ice ages and plagues and predators and asteroid impacts, and they had done it by being too stubborn to die. Fascinating, Zolthrax said, and now his clicking sound was definitely amusement because he had found something rare, and he was a collector of rare things. She will provide excellent entertainment. How long do you expect her to survive? His lieutenant, the schedule Thrax, considered the question. In 4,000 years, no specimen has ever survived round 1, he said. And this was not boasting, but simple fact, because the Crucible had been designed to be unsurvivable, and it had never failed in its purpose. The average survival time is 8.3 seconds, and the longest anyone has ever lasted is 47 seconds, and that was a silicon-based life form that technically did not die until its core crystal was shattered. He looked at the image of the human female doing her push-ups in her cell. This one might last 30 seconds, he said, and that was the highest compliment he had ever paid to a specimen. Perhaps even a full minute if she is clever. And if she survives longer than that, his lieutenant asked and immediately wished she had not, because Zolthrax turned all of his compound eyes toward her at once. No one survives round 1, he said, and his voice was cold and certain and absolute. That is not a prediction, but a law of this place, as unchangeable as gravity and as reliable as death. She will die like all the others. They always do. Far below in her cell, Kira Okonkwo finished her push-ups and stood up and stretched her arms above her head and looked around at the walls that imprisoned her, and the cameras that watched her and the guards that feared her, even though they did not understand why she was thinking. About her home, she was thinking about Lagos and the chaos and the danger and the constant struggle to survive in a city that never stopped moving and never stopped challenging and never stopped trying to kill the people who lived there. She was thinking about all the time she had pulled survivors from collapsed buildings and burning vehicles and flooded streets, and she was thinking about how they had looked at her afterward with gratitude and with hope and with the knowledge that she had refused to give up on them. She was thinking about her grandmother, who had survived a civil war, and her mother who had survived a plague, and they came for her in the dark hours when the lights in the cells dimmed to simulate something like night, though of course there was no real night in the Crucible, because the arena never truly slept. The guards were tall and armored, and they carried weapons that crackled with energy that could reduce a body to ash in less than a second, and they moved with the confidence of creatures who had never met anything they could not kill. Kira stood up before they reached her cell door. She had been expecting them. Time already? She asked, and her voice was calm and steady, and this confused the guards because specimens were supposed to scream or beg or try to fight, and this human was doing none of those things. Move, the lead guard said, and he gestured with his weapon toward the corridor that led to the preparation chambers. Kira moved. She walked between the guards with her head high and her eyes open, and she looked at everything and remembered everything, because information was survival, and survival was everything. The corridors were made of some dark metal that absorbed light and sound and hope, and they stretched on for what seemed like forever, though Kira had counted her steps and knew it was exactly 473 paces from her cell to the preparation chamber. Other prisoners were being brought from their cells as well. She saw the crystal being from the frozen moon, and it was singing to itself in frequencies that made the walls vibrate, and the guards winced, though they were too professional to show it much. She saw the plasma creature in its containment suit, and it was burning so bright with fear or anger or some other emotion that the suit could barely contain it, and the light it gave off made strange shadows on the walls. She saw the telepath from the garden world, and the poor thing was curled in on itself and weeping because it could feel the fear and despair of everyone around it, and it could not block out the noise, and it was drowning in other people's pain. Kira caught the telepath's eyes as they passed each other. She thought about strength and calm and survival, and she thought about hope, and she projected these feelings as hard as she could, even though she had no idea if she was doing it right, because she was not a telepath and did not know the rules. The telepath looked up at her with wide, wet eyes. Something passed between them. The telepath stopped crying. Kira nodded once and kept walking. The preparation chamber was a large room filled with other prisoners from 100 different worlds, and they all looked exactly the same way, which was terrified and hopeless and ready to die. Arena Master Zolthrak stood on a platform above them, and his compound eyes swept across the crowd like searchlights looking for something interesting. "Welcome to the Crucible of Vexnar," he said, and his voice echoed off the walls and filled the room, and left no space for any other sound. "You have been brought here to serve a purpose, and that purpose is to die." Some of the prisoners whimpered. Some of them screamed. Kira listened. In 4,000 years, no one has survived round one. Zolthrax continued, and there was something almost like pride in his voice, like he was an artist showing off his greatest work. "This is not an exaggeration, and it is not a boast, and it is not something that can be changed by courage or cleverness or luck. It is simply the truth. You will enter the arena, and you will face what waits for you there, and you will die, and your deaths will entertain the billions who watch from across the galaxy, and that will be the sum total of your contribution to the universe. That is your purpose, and that is your fate, and there is nothing you can do to change it. He paused. However, the word hung in the air like a knife waiting to fall, on the impossible chance that any of you should survive round 1. And the subsequent rounds that would follow, you would be granted your freedom and wealth beyond your imagining, and a ship to take you wherever you wish to go. But this has never happened, and it will never happen, and I mention it only because tradition requires me to do so. Kira raised her hand. The room went silent, every eye turned toward her. Even Zolthrax seemed surprised, though it was hard to tell with compound eyes. Question, Kira said, and her voice was as calm as if she were asking for directions to the nearest food dispenser. What time is breakfast? For a long moment no one moved, no one spoke, no one breathed. Then Zolthrax made his clicking sound and it echoed through the chamber like stones falling into a deep well. Take them to the arena, he said, and if his voice held something that might have been amusement or curiosity or something else, entirely no one was brave enough to comment on it. The arena was vast. Kira had seen stadiums on Earth that could hold 100,000 people. But this place made those look like children's playgrounds. It was a bowl carved into the stone of the planet itself, and it stretched for kilometers in every direction, and the stands rose up and up and up until they disappeared into clouds that had formed inside the structure itself, and in those stands were billions of viewers. Not in person, of course, because the arena could not hold that many physical bodies, but through screens and projections and direct neural feeds that let them experience every moment of what was about to happen as if they were there themselves. They were hungry. Kira could feel their hunger like a physical weight pressing down on her shoulders. They wanted blood. They wanted death. They wanted entertainment. 50 prisoners stood on the sand of the arena floor, and they were all that remained from the thousands that had been harvested because the others had been sorted into different rounds and different deaths and different forms of entertainment. The sand beneath their feet was not sand, it was ground bone. Millions of years of ground bone from the millions of creatures who had died here before. Welcome to round 1. A voice boomed from speakers, hidden somewhere in the walls. You faced the mawworm. The ground began to shake. From beneath the bone sand, something began to rise, and it was so large that Kira's mind could not process it at first, and she had to look at it in pieces because looking at it all at once would have broken something inside her. It was a worm, but calling it a worm was like calling a hurricane a breeze. It was kilometers long, and its body was covered in segments of armor that looked like they could deflect starship weapons, and its mouth was a circle of teeth that rotated like a meat grinder made for planets. It roared, and the sound was so deep that Kira felt it in her bones and her blood and her soul, and all around her prisoners fell to their knees and covered their ears and screamed in terror that no longer had words. Average survival time 8.3 seconds. That was what Zolthrax had said. Kira believed him. She also did not care. Everybody move, she screamed, and her voice cut through the terror like a blade, and some of the prisoners looked at her, and in their eyes she saw the tiniest spark of something that might have been hope. Get behind it and stay behind it and do not stop moving. She ran not away from the mawworm because there was nowhere to run to, and the arena walls were smooth and high and impossible to climb. She ran toward it. The creature sensed her movement, and it turned its massive head toward her, and those rotating teeth began to spin faster, and it lunged. Kira threw herself to the side at the last possible second. She rolled across the bone sand and came up running, and she had seen what she needed to see. Mawworm was fast, but it was not agile. It could not turn quickly, and behind its head, where its sensory clusters were located, there was a blind spot about 50 meters wide, where it could not see or smell or feel anything. She ran for that blind spot. The worm lunged again, and again she dodged, and this time she came up right where she wanted to be, directly behind its head, in the zone where it could not perceive her. Here, she screamed at the other prisoners. Get here now. Some of them were too frozen with fear to move. Some of them moved too slowly. Worms' tails swept across the arena, and bodies flew through the air and hit the walls with sounds that Kira would hear in her nightmares for the rest of her life. But some of them made it. The telepath made it crawling on hands and knees with tears still streaming down her face, but moving forward anyway, because she had felt Kira's determination and it had given her something to hold on to. The plasma being made it burning so bright that the worm flinched away from it and gave others time to escape its sweeping tail. Even the crystal being made it singing in frequencies that seemed to confuse the worm's senses and create interference in its hunting patterns. They huddled together in the blind spot, and the worm spun in circles trying to find them, and it roared in frustration, and the crowd above them had gone very, very quiet. Minutes past 10 minutes, 20 minutes. The worm was getting tired. Kira had noticed something when she was studying it during those first desperate seconds. It was a creature built for ambush, not for sustained hunting, and its metabolism was burning through energy faster than it could replenish, and its movements were getting slower, and its roars were getting weaker. "It is dying," the telepath whispered, and her voice was hoarse from crying, but there was wonder in it too. "I can feel it dying." "Not dying," Kira said, and she was watching the worm with eyes that had learned to read the signs of exhaustion in 1,000 different creatures across a dozen disaster zones. "Just tired." "We wait." They waited 47 minutes. After round 1 began, the mallworm collapsed. Its massive body hit the bone sand with an impact that shook the entire arena, and it lay there breathing in great heaving gasps, and it did not get up because it could not get up because it had nothing left. Kira walked out from behind its hedge. She walked across the arena floor. The arena masters did not know what to do with Kira Okonkwo. 4,000 years. The Crucible of Vexaner had developed a system, and that system was perfect, and that system was simple, and that system went like this: prisoners came in, prisoners died. Audiences watched, credits flowed. No one had ever disrupted this system before, and no one had ever been expected to disrupt it, and the arena's designers had not built contingency plans for what to do when someone refused to follow the rules. They did the only thing they knew how to do. They tried to kill her hard. Round 2 was acid rain. They put Kira and the 12 survivors from round 1 into an enclosed dome, and they opened vents in the ceiling, and they poured down liquid that could dissolve flesh from bone in seconds. The other survivors panicked. They ran in circles and screamed, and some of them fell and were eaten by the acid before they could get up again, and the audience watched with the hungry eyes of predators who had finally found prey that was worth watching. Kira did not panic. She looked up at the ceiling, and she counted the vents, and she noticed that they were not everywhere. And she noticed that the acid was flowing in patterns, and she noticed that there were gaps in those patterns where nothing fell. "Follow me," she shouted, and she ran for the nearest safe zone, and the survivors who trusted her followed, and the survivors who did not trust her died. 8 made it. They huddled in the safe zones, and they moved when the patterns shifted, and they survived for 3 hours until the acid ran out, and the arena masters had to admit defeat. Round 3 was gravity wells. Random sections of the arena floor would suddenly experience 10 times normal gravity, and anything standing in those sections would be crushed flat, and anything flying over those sections would be slammed down and shattered. The plasma being died in round 3. Its containment suit could not handle the stress, and it ruptured, and the being inside dissipated into light and heat, and then into nothing, and Kira watched it go with grief in her heart, but steel in her eyes. 6 survivors left. Kira learned to feel the vibration in the floor that came a half second before the gravity wells activated, and she taught the others to feel it too, and they danced through the killing field like they were playing some deadly game of hop and skip. Round 4 was the razor flies, a swarm of 1 billion insects, each one the size of a fingernail, and each one equipped with wings that could cut through steel, and they moved like a cloud of living death, and there was nowhere to hide and nowhere to run. Kira noticed that the razor flies were attracted to movement and body heat, and she noticed that they had a hive mind that made them slow. To adapt to unexpected patterns, she told everyone to stand still, perfectly still, not even breathing unless they absolutely had to. For 6 hours they stood like statues while the razorflies swirled around them searching for targets and finding none. And eventually, the swarm exhausted itself because it had been designed for quick kills, not prolonged. Hunt's 5 survivors left. Rounds 5 through 10 were a blur of horrors hunting. Packs from 6 different worlds that had to be outmaneuvered, and HFY poison gas that had to be breathed in tiny sips while filters were improvised from clothing temperature. Extremes that went from freezing to boiling in seconds and required perfect timing to survive predators that hunted by sound, which meant perfect silence. Predators that hunted by scent, which meant covering themselves in the blood of fallen. Arena beast predators that hunted by psychic signature, which meant the telepath had to project false minds to lead them away each round. Killed someone each round. Kira learned something each round. She taught the survivors what she had learned by round 10. There were only 3 of them left. Kira the telepath, whose name was Vexia, and who had discovered that her gift was not a curse, but a weapon when used correctly, and the crystal being whose name was Harmonix, and who had learned that its songs could do more than shatter stone, and could also heal wounds and calm fears, and create barriers of sound that stopped attacks cold. They were not just survivors anymore. They were a team, and watching from his observation pod, Arena Master Zolthrax was beginning to understand that he had made a terrible mistake. She should be dead, he said, and he had been saying this after every round, and it was starting to sound less like a statement of fact and more like a prayer. The mathematics do not allow for this. His lieutenant, who had been promoted 3 times in the past week, because everyone above her kept being executed for failing to kill, one human female stood beside him and said nothing because she had learned that saying nothing was often the safest choice. Perhaps she finally ventured when the silence had become unbearable. Perhaps the mathematics did not account for Deathworld evolution. Zolthrax turned all of his compound eyes toward her, and she prepared herself to die. Explain. The other specimens evolved on worlds with predictable dangers, she said, and her voice was shaking. But she kept talking because she had a theory, and theories were sometimes worth dying for. They evolved to survive specific threats in specific ways, and when they face threats, they did not evolve, for they cannot adapt, and they die. But humans, she pulled up the data on her pad. Humans evolved on a world with no predictable dangers, and every possible danger, and their entire evolutionary strategy is based on adaptation and learning and refusing to die. No matter what is trying to kill them, they do not have a solution for every problem. They have something better. They have the ability to invent solutions for problems they have never seen before. Zolthrax stared at the data for a long moment. You are saying that we cannot kill her because her species evolved specifically to be unkillable. I am saying that we cannot kill her using methods she has time to study and adapt to, his lieutenant said, and she was committed now, and she might as well say everything she was thinking. Every round we give her time, and every round she uses that time to learn, and every round she comes out stronger than she went in. Then we give her no time, Zolthrax said, and his mandibles clicked with something that might have been anticipation. We use the Void Hunter. His lieutenant went very still. Arena Master, the Void Hunter has only been used once, and that was to execute an entire planetary rebellion, and it destroyed everything within 100 kilometers and took 3 centuries for the radiation to clear. I know, Zolthrax said. Using it on 3 prisoners would be like using a supernova to light a candle. I know. The cost alone would. I do not care about the cost, Zolthrax said, and his voice was cold and hard and absolute. I care about maintaining the integrity of the Crucible, and I care about demonstrating that no one survives our arena, and I care about ending this anomaly before it becomes something worse. He turned to face his lieutenant directly. In 4,000 years we have built something perfect, and we have built something feared, and we have built something that keeps the Dominion stable because everyone knows that resistance is futile and death is inevitable. This human is threatening all of that, not because she is strong, not because she is clever, but because she is showing people that impossible things can be done. And if people start believing in impossible things, he did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. His lieutenant understood hope was the most dangerous weapon in the universe, and Kira Okonkwo was handing it out like candy down in the survivor quarters. Kira was teaching Vesalia and harmonics the human concept of push-ups, which they found both confusing and slightly ridiculous, but they did them anyway because Kira asked them to, and because they trusted her with their lives. "Why do you do this?" Vexalia asked, and her mental voice was tired but curious. "Because it makes you stronger," Kira said. "But we might die tomorrow, and then the strength will not matter." Kira smiled, and it was the same smile she had worn in round 1, and in every round since everything might kill us tomorrow. She said, "That has never been a good reason to stop trying to get stronger. That is very human thinking." Harmonics sang, and its crystal voice made the words sound like music. "Yes, it is," Kira agreed. "And that is why we are still alive." She did not know that the next round would be the Void Hunter. She did not know that the Arena Masters had decided to stop playing games and start trying to destroy her with the most powerful weapon in their arsenal. But somewhere deep inside her, where her ancestors lived and where their strength ran through her blood like fire, she knew that something was coming, something big, something dangerous, something that would test everything she had learned and everything she was. And she smiled, because that was what humans did when the odds were impossible and the danger was overwhelming and everyone around them had given up hope. They smiled and they got ready to fight. The arena was different this time. Kira knew something was wrong the moment they brought her and Vexalia and Harmonics out of their quarters and led them not to the main Colosseum but to a different place entirely. This place was older. The walls were not made of the same dark metal as the rest of the crucible, but of something that looked like frozen night and felt like standing next to a void in space itself. The air was cold, not the kind of cold that came from temperature, but the kind of cold that came from absence, like heat itself was afraid to exist in this place. "What is this?" Vexalia whispered, and her mental voice was small and frightened in a way it had not been since round 1. "I do not know," Kira admitted, and that admission cost her something because she had been the one with answers, and without answers, she was just another frightened creature waiting to die. "But we will figure it out. We always do." They were led into a pit. It was deep and circular, and the walls rose up so high that they disappeared into darkness, and there were no stands here and no audience and no cameras that Kira could see, just the three of them and whatever was waiting. Arena Master Zolthrax's voice echoed down from somewhere above, and it sounded different now, and there was something in it that might have been respect, or might have been fear, or might have been something else entirely. "You have done something remarkable," he said. "In 4,000 years, no one has survived round 1, and you have survived 18 rounds, and you have made a mockery of everything we have built, and you have become something that I did not think was possible. A threat." Kira looked up toward the voice, though she could not see its source. "So kill me," she said, and her voice did not shake. "That is what you have been trying to do from the beginning. What is one more round?" "This is not a round," Zolthrax said. "This is an execution." The walls began to change from the surface of the frozen night. Stone something began to emerge, and it was not a creature, and it was not a machine, and it was not anything that had a name in any language. Kira knew it was darkness, but not darkness like the absence of light. Darkness like the presence of something else, something that consumed, something that was hungry, something that had no mind but had purpose. And that purpose was to erase everything it touched from existence itself. This is the Void Hunter. Zolthrak said, and his voice was almost gentle, not like a parent explaining something terrible to a child. It was created 10,000 years ago by a species that no longer exists because they were the first thing it consumed. It does not hunt by sight or sound or smell. It hunts by existence. If you exist, it will find you. If it finds you, it will consume you. Not kill you. Consume you. There will be nothing left. Not a body. Not a memory. Not even a ghost. The darkness began to move it. Did not flow like liquid or drift like gas, but moved like nothing Kira had ever seen, and it was coming toward them, and it was slow, but it was inevitable, and there was nowhere to run. I cannot feel it. Vexalia said, and her mental voice was edged with panic. Try to read it, and there is nothing there, and it is like trying to read the thoughts of a hole in the universe. I cannot affect it either. Harmonix sang, and its crystal voice was discordant. With fear, my frequencies pass through it and do nothing, and it is like trying to make music in a vacuum. Kira watched the darkness approach. She thought about everything she had learned in 18 rounds, and she thought about everything she knew. About hunting and survival and predators and prey. The Void Hunter was perfect. It had no weaknesses that she could see. It had no patterns she could exploit. It had no biology she could understand, but it was slow, and it was hunting by existence, and existence meant energy, and energy meant heat. Vexalia, Kira said, and her voice was calm, even though her heart was racing because she had an idea, and ideas were dangerous, but they were all she had. Can you sense heat? Yes. Can you sense where the heat in this room is concentrated? Vexalia closed her eyes and reached out with her mind, and after a moment she opened them again. It is hunting our body heat, she said, and there was understanding in her mental voice now. It is drawn to warmth, because warmth is existence, and existence is what it consumes. Harmonix, Kira said, and she was thinking faster than she had ever thought in her life. Your songs can create heat, can they not? They can create vibration. Harmonix sang, and vibration creates heat. Yes, I need you to sing. Sing the loudest and hottest song you have ever sung. Not at the Void Hunter, at the walls. Harmonix understood. The crystal being raised its arms and opened its mouth, which was not really a mouth but a resonance chamber, and it began to sing. The sound was beyond hearing, was a frequency so low that it made the walls vibrate, and so high that it made the air shimmer and everything in between all at once, and where the sound hit the walls, heat began to build. The frozen night stone began to warm, and the Void Hunter hesitated. Its movement, which had been steady and inevitable, suddenly wavered as it sensed heat coming from multiple directions, and its simple consuming purpose was confused by conflicting signals. More, Kira said. Give it more heat. Harmonix sang louder. The walls were glowing now with absorbed energy, and the Void Hunter was spinning in circles trying to find the strongest source of existence to consume, and it was no longer moving toward them. Was moving toward the walls. It cannot think, Vexalia said, and there was wonder in her mental voice. It has no mind at all, and it just follows the heat, and we can lead it. We can lead it right back where it came from. Kira smiled. Exactly. For 6 hours they played a deadly game of misdirection. Harmonix would sing and create heat in one section of walls, and the Void Hunter would pursue it, and then Harmonix would stop and sing somewhere else, and the Void Hunter would change direction, over and over, round and round. The creature that had consumed a species and ended a planetary rebellion was being led in circles by 3 exhausted prisoners who refused to give up, and slowly, ever so slowly, they led it back toward the place in the walls where it had emerged. Now, Kira shouted, everything you have got. Hit it now. Harmonix sang a note that should not have been possible. Every crystal in its body vibrated at a frequency that was designed for one purpose, and one purpose only: to create heat, not warmth, not energy heat, pure and overwhelming, and concentrated into a beam that hit the Void Hunter from behind. just as it was trying to return to its origin point. And something impossible happened. The darkness that consumed all things met heat that was too intense to consume. And instead of eating it, the Void Hunter was overwhelmed by it, and the consuming was reversed, and the darkness began to crystallize it. Screamed, not with sound, with the dying echo of something that had existed for 10,000 years finally, meeting something it could not devour, and then it was over the void. Hunter lay in the center of the pit, crystallized into solid darkness that would never move again, and Harmonix collapsed from exhaustion, and Vexelia fell to her knees gasping, and Kira stood in the center of it all, covered in sweat and shaking with fatigue, but alive, still alive. She looked up toward where she knew Zolthrax was watching. She waved, she smiled. What is next? She called out, and her voice was hoarse, but it carried. I could really use that shower now. Above the pit arena master, Zolthrax stared at the crystallized remains of the most powerful weapon in the Dominion's arsenal. His lieutenant stood beside him, and for once she had nothing to say. What are humans? Zolthrax whispered. It was not a question he expected an answer to. It was not a question he was sure he wanted answered, because the answer was becoming clear, and the answer was terrifying. Humans were not the strongest species in the galaxy. They were not the fastest or the smartest or the most advanced, but they were something else. They were the species that looked at impossible odds and smiled. They were the species that faced certain death and asked what was for breakfast. They were the species that had crawled out of a death world and spread across the stars, not because they were better than everyone else, but because they refused to accept that anything could stop them. And now one of them was standing in his arena, still alive, still smiling, still asking for a shower, and Arena Master Zolthrax felt something he had not felt in 4,000 years of watching creatures die for his entertainment. Felt afraid of what she might do next. The news spread across the galaxy like fire through dry grass in mining colonies where slaves worked until they died and were replaced by more slaves. Whispers began to circulate about a human female who had survived the unsurvivable arena in prison. Worlds where political dissidents were sent to be forgotten. Stories were told of a woman from a death world who had smiled at death, and death had blinked first in the hidden places where resistance movements met in secret and planned rebellions. That never quite happened. A name was spoken with something that sounded almost like Reverend Skira Okonkwo, woman who would not die by round 40. She had become the most watched contestant in the 4,000-year history of the Crucible of Vexenor. Viewership had increased by 4,000%. Gambling syndicates across 100 worlds had collapsed and reformed around the simple question of whether she would survive the next round. 7 different planets' religious cults had formed, declaring her the avatar of ancient war goddesses and building shrines with her image carved in stone and metal. And in the Crucible itself, something even stranger was happening. The slaves were watching her, the guards were watching her, the administrators and bureaucrats and countless functionaries who kept the arena running were all watching her. They were starting to believe in something they had forgotten how to believe in. The phrase started small. Someone wrote it on a wall in the slave quarters, and no one knew who had done it, and no one came forward to claim credit. Earth endures. 2 words, simple words, but they spread. Soon they were everywhere, scratched into cell walls, whispered in corridors, hummed as work songs in the maintenance tunnels. Earth endures, and everyone knew what it meant. It meant that if a single human from a single death world could survive the unsurvivable, then maybe other impossible things could happen too. Maybe chains could be broken, maybe walls could fall, maybe the Dominion that had ruled with fear for millennia was not as invincible as it seemed. Arena Master Zolthrax watched all of this happening, and he understood exactly what he was seeing, and it filled him with a rage that burned hotter than any plasma being had ever burned. She must die, he told his council, and his voice was calm, but his mandibles were clicking so fast they sounded like gunfire. Not next round and not next week and not when it is convenient, but now and today and before this goes any further. His advisors shifted uncomfortably. Arena Master. One of them ventured, and her voice was careful because advisors who were not careful tended to become arena fodder. The ratings have never been higher, and the revenue is unprecedented, and there are those who feel that perhaps she did not get. To finish her sentences, Zolthrax moved faster than something his size should have been able to move, and when he was done moving, the advisor was in several pieces, and the other advisors were reconsidering their career choices. Revenue is irrelevant, Zolthrax said, and he was cleaning his manipulator arms with a cloth that had been wiped before and was not white anymore. The crucible does not exist to generate revenue. The crucible exists to generate despair. And right now, a single human female is doing the opposite. He turned to face the surviving advisors. By round 50, she will be dead. I do not care what it takes. I do not care what it costs. I do not care if I have to burn this entire facility to the ground and rebuild it. From the ashes, she dies. And so the killing began in earnest. Rounds 20 through 50 were designed by the cruelest minds in the Dominion, and they were given unlimited resources and a single command: kill the human, kill her hope, kill everything she represents. They threw ancient war machines at her that had been designed to end civilizations. Kira found their power cores and overloaded them and walked away from the explosions. They created gene-crafted abominations that combined the deadliest traits of 1,000 species into single nightmarish forms. Kira studied their biology and found their weaknesses and turned them against each other and stood among the bodies. When the slaughter was done, they brought in champions from conquered species who had been promised their freedom if they killed her. Kira talked to them before the rounds began, and she learned their names and their stories. And when the killing was over, she wept for them, even as she survived them. And with each round, her army grew because she was not just surviving anymore, she was recruiting. After round 23, she found a soldier from a world that had fallen to the Dominion a century ago, and she convinced him that dying in the arena was not the only option. After round 31, she rescued a scientist who had been studying the arena systems, and that scientist showed her the maintenance tunnels and the blind spots in the surveillance network. After round 38, she encountered a former ship pilot who had been captured running supplies to a resistance cell, and that pilot told her about the layout of the facility and where the exits were, and how many guards stood between them and freedom. By round 40, she had 23 survivors following her, and they were not just survivors anymore. They were soldiers. They were believers. They were the beginning of something that Zolthrax had spent 4,000 years making sure could never exist. They were a revolution down in the tunnels beneath the arena, in a space that had once been a storage room and was now a command center. Kira gathered her people, and she looked at their faces, and she saw fear and hope and determination all mixed together. They are going to throw everything at us now, she said, and her voice was tired because she had not slept properly in weeks, but it was still strong. They know what we represent, and they know they cannot let us survive, because if we survive, then everyone watching will know that survival is possible, and that scares them more than anything. Vashalia, who had grown from a weeping pacifist into something harder and sharper, stood at Kira's side, and her telepathic presence provided comfort and coordination for the whole group. I can feel the fear spreading through the facility, she said. The guards are afraid of us now. The administrators are afraid. Even Zolthrax is afraid, though he would never admit it. Harmonix, who had learned that its songs could inspire as well as destroy, added its crystal voice to the conversation. What do we do with fear? It sang. Fear is a weapon, and it can cut both ways. Kira smiled, that same smile that had become famous across the galaxy, that same smile that appeared on the shrines being built in her name. We do what humans have always done with fear, she said. We acknowledge it, and we accept it, and then we move forward anyway, Because fear is not the enemy. Giving up is the enemy. And we do not give up. We do not surrender. We do not stop. She looked around at her little army of survivors and misfits and believers. In a few hours they are going to open round 50, and they are going to throw something terrible at us, and they are going to expect us to die. And we might die. I will not lie to you about that. But if we die fighting. And if we live, she let the silence hang for a moment. If we live, we make them regret ever taking us from our homes. The survivors cheered it. It was not a loud cheer, because they were still hiding and sound carried in the tunnels, but it was a real cheer, the cheer of people who had found something worth fighting for and watching through a hidden camera that he thought no one knew about. Arena Master Zolthrak saw that cheer and heard those words and felt the last remnants of his confidence crumble into dust. She was not supposed to inspire people, she was supposed to die. They were all supposed to die. That was how it worked. That was how it had always worked. But somehow this human female from a Deathworld had rewritten the rules, and now everything was falling apart, and he did not know how to stop it. Round 50. He said to himself, everything ends in round 50. But even as he said it, he was not sure he believed it anymore. Because Kira Okonkwo was still smiling, and the galaxy was starting to smile with her. Round 50 was supposed to be the end. Arena Master Zolthrax had gathered every resource at his disposal, and he had called in favors from across the Dominion, and he had prepared a spectacle that would crush the rebellion before it could truly begin. He had brought in the executioners. They were not organic creatures, and they were not simple machines, but something in between that had been engineered over centuries for a single purpose. Killing each executioner was 3 meters tall and covered in armor that could withstand starship weapons and equipped with blades that could cut through anything, and powered by cores that would keep them fighting for 1,000 years. There were 50 of them, and they had never failed to kill a target. In the entire history of their existence, the arena floor was cleared, and the cameras were focused, and across the galaxy billions of viewers tuned in to watch what the Dominion had promised would be the final chapter of the human anomaly. Kira stood at the center of the arena with her army of survivors behind her. 3 fighters who had learned to work together and trust each other and believe in something bigger than themselves. Facing 50 perfect killing machines, the odds were impossible, but then again, so were they. Remember the plan, Kira said, and her voice was steady, though her heart was pounding. We do not try to destroy them because we cannot destroy them. We use them against each other. The executioners activated, their optical sensors lit up with red light, and their blades extended with sounds like screaming metal, and they began to advance across the arena floor in perfect formation. Kira gave the signal. Her people scattered. They had practiced this in the tunnels, using simulations and mock-ups and endless hours of drilling. And now they executed the plan with the precision of dancers in a deadly ballet. Vex Alia reached out with her mind and touched the primitive neural networks that guided the executioners, and she could not control them, but she could confuse them and make them see enemies where there were none. Harmonics sang frequencies that interfered with their targeting systems and made their weapons lock onto each other instead of the scattered humans and aliens who were running between them. The others used hit and run tactics that Kira had taught them. Strike fast, move faster, never stay in one place long enough to become a target. Slowly and possibly, the executioners began to fall, not because the survivors destroyed them, but because they destroyed each other. Confused sensors and corrupted targeting and centuries of programming that had never been tested against enemies who fought like this. By the time the dust settled, 43 executioners lay in pieces on the arena floor, and the remaining 7 had shut down from cascade failures in their neural networks, and all 23 survivors were still standing. The audience was silent. Then they erupted. The sound that came from the stands was not like anything the Crucible had ever heard before, and it was not a sound of bloodlust or entertainment, but something else. It was a sound of joy, of hope, of people who had forgotten what it felt like to see the impossible happen, watching it happen right in front of their eyes. And then something even more remarkable occurred. A slave in the maintenance tunnels, who had been watching on a hidden screen, took a deep breath and walked up to his overseer and struck him down with a tool he had been using to repair machinery, a guard in the prisoner. Blocks, who had been questioning her loyalties for months, opened a cell door and let the prisoners out and joined them as they ran toward the arena. An administrator, who had been cooking the books for years to help the resistance, finally made her move and locked Zolthrax out of the main control systems all across the crucible of Vexaner. People who had been waiting for a sign finally got their sign, and they rose up. It was chaos. It was beautiful. Kira heard the sounds of fighting spreading through the facility, and she understood what was happening, and she felt tears in her eyes for the first time since she had been taken from Earth, the lower levels. She said, and her voice cracked with emotion, "There are 10,000 prisoners in the reserve stock waiting to be used in future rounds. We free them, and we have an army." Her people followed her through corridors that were now battlegrounds. They fought their way deeper into the facility, and everywhere they went, slaves joined them, and guards either fled or fell, and the revolution that had started with a single smile spread like wildfire. The reserve stock was held in a massive chamber deep beneath the arena, and the doors were reinforced and guarded by automated systems that should have been impenetrable. Harmonics sang them open. Crystal Being had grown so much since round one, and its songs could do things now that its creators on the gas giant would never have believed possible. The doors shattered like glass, and 10,000 prisoners stared out at their liberators with eyes that did not know how to process what they were seeing. "My name is Kira Okonkwo," Kira said, and her voice carried through the chamber like a promise. "I am from a planet called Earth. I was taken from my home just like you were taken from yours, and I have been fighting in the arena for 50 rounds, and I am still alive." The prisoners stirred. Some of them had heard her name, and some of them had not, but all of them could feel that something momentous was happening. "The Dominion wants us to believe that we are nothing," Kira continued. "They want us to believe that our only purpose is to die for their entertainment. They want us to believe that resistance is futile and hope is foolish, and the only option is to accept our fate. They are wrong." She raised her fist. "We are not nothing. We are not entertainment. We are not going to accept any fate that we did not choose for ourselves. Today, we take back our lives. Today, we take back our freedom. Today, the crucible of Vexaner falls." The cheer that rose from 10,000 throats shook the walls of the chamber. It was the sound of chains breaking. It was the sound of hope being reborn. It was the sound of a revolution finally beginning. Within hours, the crucible was theirs. The guards who fought were overwhelmed by sheer numbers, and the guards who surrendered were imprisoned in the cells that had once held slaves. The administrative staff were rounded up and held for judgment by the people. They had helped to oppress the oppressed. The automated systems were shut down and reprogrammed, and the weapons that had been used to kill so many were turned toward defense and arena master. Zolthrax retreated to his tower and watched his life's work crumble, and felt something he had not felt in 4,000 years. Despair. His lieutenant, the one who had survived all the others, was still with him, and she stood at the window looking down at the chaos below. "It is over," she said, and her voice was quiet. "They have won. It is not over," Zolthrax said, and his mandibles clicked slowly. "I still have one option." He moved to a panel hidden behind his observation screens, and he entered a code that only he knew, and the panel opened to reveal a single switch. The fusion core. His lieutenant said, and there was no fear in her voice, only resignation. "You would destroy everything within 50 kilometers. Them and us and the entire facility." "Yes, to what end?" "To demonstrate that the Dominion does not lose," Zolthrax said, and his manipulator arm reached for the switch. "To show the galaxy that resistance leads only to death. to ensure that this never happens again. His arm stopped because someone was standing in the doorway. Kira Okonkwo looked exhausted and battered, and covered in blood that was mostly not her own. But she was still standing, and she was still smiling. "You could do it," she said. "You could kill everyone. Me and my people and your own staff. Make it a draw." Zolthrax turned to face her, and his compound eyes reflected her image 1,000 times. "But you will not." "Why not?" "Because then you do not get to see." Round 99. Kira said, and she took a step forward. "And you need to know how this ends. It is the same reason I am still alive. I was always too curious to die." For a long moment, the arena master and the human female stared at each other across the room. Then Zolthrax lowered his arm. "What happens now?" he asked. Kira's smile widened. "Now," she said, "we show the galaxy something it has never seen before. We show them what happens when the arena fights back." The Dominion fleet arrived 40 days after the uprising. 12 dreadnoughts and 100 cruisers and 1,000 smaller vessels, all bearing down on the crucible of Vexaner with enough firepower to crack the planet itself if necessary. The Supreme Chancellor had decided that half measures were insufficient, and that the only way to stamp out the spark that Kira Okonkwo had lit was to demonstrate overwhelming and absolute power. He had also decided to come personally because this was not just a military operation, but a symbol, and symbols required the presence of those who embodied them. His flagship was the largest ship in the fleet, and it hung in orbit above the arena complex like a sword waiting to fall. "Surrender." He broadcast to the surface below, "and your deaths will be quick. Resist, and they will be slow. You have 1 hour to decide." In the Grand Coliseum, Kira listened to the broadcast and smiled, not because she had a fleet to match theirs, and not because she had weapons that could threaten their ships, and not because she had any military advantage at all. She smiled because she knew something the Chancellor did not know. She smiled because the fleet was not the only thing that had arrived over the past 40 days. The message she had broadcast had done its work. In the mining colony's slaves had risen up and seized control of the facilities that powered the Dominion's economy. In the shipyard's workers had sabotaged vessels and stolen others, and disappeared into the void between stars. In military installations across the Empire, soldiers who had been questioning their loyalties for years had finally made their choice. The Dominion was not fighting a rebellion on one world. It was fighting rebellions on 1,000 worlds, and the fleet that hung above the crucible was the fleet that was not suppressing those rebellions. "You want to see round 99, Kira said, and her voice was carried to every ship in the fleet by communication systems that the Liberators had captured and repurposed. "Then come down here and see it. Traditional rules, survival combat. 1 round, winner takes all." The Chancellor was not a warrior. He was a politician and an administrator, and he had not personally fought anyone in centuries. But he understood what Kira was offering. She was offering a story and narrative that the galaxy could follow, a simple contest with a clear winner and a clear loser. If he refused, he would look weak, and his power depended on never looking weak. If he accepted and won, he would prove that the Dominion was still supreme, and the rebellion would collapse without its symbol. If he accepted and lost, but he would not lose. He had the best soldiers in the Empire, and the best weapons and the best training, and one human female, no matter how remarkable, could not stand against all of that. Accepted. He broadcast, "But not me personally. I will send my champion, the greatest warrior in the Dominion. And when she falls, you will see that your hope was always an illusion." Kira nodded. "Bring your champion. We will be waiting." The shuttle descended through the atmosphere with an escort of gunships, and it landed in the arena that had once been the site of so much death and was now something else entirely. The stands were filled with freed prisoners and former slaves and people who had traveled From across the sector to witness this moment, cameras broadcast everything to 700 billion viewers, and in the center of the sand stood Kira Okonkwo, waiting for whatever came next. The shuttle's doors opened. The champion of the Dominion emerged. It was a creature from a world that bred warriors the way other worlds bred livestock, and it stood 4 meters tall and was covered in armor that was bonded to its skin, and it carried weapons in each of its 6 arms, and its eyes held nothing but the promise of death. It had killed 10. The message went out to 700 billion viewers across the Dominion, not because the Crucible's communication systems were designed for that kind of reach, but because, by this point, every major news network and entertainment channel and underground information broker in the galaxy had their sensors pointed at Vexana, and they were all desperate to see what happened next. Kira stood in the center of the Grand Colosseum with cameras floating around her, capturing every angle, and behind her stood not prisoners anymore, but free people from 100 different worlds who had survived the arena and the uprising and were now part of something new. Arena Master Zolthrax stood on the sand as well, but in chains now, with guards surrounding him, and with the knowledge that his 4,000 years of power had come to an end. Audience that filled the stands was not the usual crowd of wealthy spectators who paid fortunes to watch creatures die. It was the former slaves and prisoners and workers of the Crucible who had fought for their freedom and won it. Watching from every corner of the galaxy were the billions who had tuned in expecting another round of death and were about to receive something very different. "My name is Kira Okonkwo," she said, and her voice was carried by systems that had been designed to broadcast screams and turn them into something else. 3 months ago, I was taken from my home on a planet called Earth and brought to this place to die. They told me that no one survives round 1. They told me that my only purpose was to provide entertainment for people who had forgotten what it means to value life. They were wrong. She gestured at the people behind her. "We are the survivors of the Crucible of Vexana. We come from 100 different worlds, and we speak 100 different languages, and we have nothing in common except this. We refused to die when they told us to. We refused to give up when they said there was no hope. We refused to accept that our lives were worth nothing more than a few moments of entertainment for people who have never had to fight for anything." She turned to face the cameras directly. "To everyone watching, I want you to understand something. The Dominion has built its power on the belief that resistance is futile. They have spent millennia teaching people that fighting back only leads to suffering and that the only wise choice is to submit. They want you to believe that you are powerless. They are lying. I am living proof that they are lying. Every person standing behind me is living proof. Every slave who rose up today and every guard who changed sides and every person who finally found the courage to say enough is living proof. You are not powerless. You have never been powerless. They've just been very good at making you forget your power." The crowd in the stands was silent, not because they were unmoved, but because they were moved so deeply that words would have felt inadequate across the galaxy. The same silence spread. Slaves paused in their work. Prisoners looked up from their despair. People who had given up hope years ago felt something stirring in their chests that they did not recognize at first because it had been so long since they had felt it. "I know what you are thinking," Kira continued. "You are thinking that this is just one facility and that the Dominion has 1,000 more and that they will crush this rebellion like they have crushed every rebellion before. Maybe you are right. Maybe they will come for us with their fleets and their armies and their endless resources. Maybe everyone standing in this arena will be dead within a week. But that is not the point. The point is that we are standing here at all. The point is that we proved it is possible. The thing is that we proved it is possible. The point is that we are standing here at all. The point is that we proved it is possible. Point is that somewhere right now, some prisoner in some cell on some forgotten world is watching this and realizing that the walls around them are not as strong as they thought. We did not win this battle because we were stronger than the walls around them are not as strong as they thought. We did not win this battle because we were stronger than the were strong as they thought. We did not win this battle because we were stronger than the Dominion. We won because we were willing to fight when everyone told us fighting was pointless. And that is something anyone can do. She pointed at the camera, to the slaves in the Mayan colonies. Earth endures. Rise up. To the prisoners in the labor camps. Earth endures. Fight back. To every person in every corner of this galaxy who has been told that they do not matter and their life is not their own. Earth endures. Prove them wrong. The silence broke first from the crowd in the stands as the freed slaves and prisoners began to chant, and then from beyond the walls of the arena as the chant was picked up and repeated and spread outward like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. Earth endures. Earth endures. Earth endures in the mining colonies. The slaves heard it and looked at each other, and something passed between them that did not need words in. The prison worlds, the inmates heard it, and stood up from their bunks and began to move toward the doors in the hidden places where resistance movements had been quietly waiting for years. The leaders heard it and gave orders that had been prepared for this moment. Across the Dominion something was happening, something that could not be stopped with armies or threats or demonstrations of power. An idea was spreading, and ideas were the most dangerous weapons in the universe. In his throne room on the Dominion homeworld, the Supreme Chancellor watched the broadcast and felt something cold settle in his chest. He was old enough to remember the last great uprising 3 centuries ago, when a coalition of subjugated worlds had tried to break free, and how long it had taken to crush them and how close the whole thing had come to succeeding. This was worse. This was not a coalition of worlds with fleets and armies and territory to defend. This was a single human female standing in a captured arena and telling the galaxy that chains could be broken. And people were listening. Send the fleet, he said to his advisors. Destroy the Crucible and everyone in it. Broadcast the destruction to every world. Show them what happens to those who defy us. His advisors bowed and left to carry out his orders, but even as they did, the Chancellor wondered if it would be enough, because Kira Okonkwo had done something that fleets could not undo. She had given people hope, and hope once given could not be taken back. In the arena, Kira finished her speech and stepped back from the cameras, and for a moment, she was just a tired woman who had been fighting for too long and who wanted nothing more than to rest. Vexalia was beside her immediately. You did it, the telepath said, and there was wonder in her mental voice. I can feel it spreading across the galaxy. The hope, the anger, the determination. You started something that cannot be stopped. We started something, Kira corrected, and she looked at the people around her. I am just one person. None of this would have happened without everyone who fought beside me and everyone who believed when believing seemed foolish. What happens now? Harmonic sang, and its crystal voice was warm with affection. The Dominion will not let this stand. Kira smiled. Now we prepare for what comes next. They will send their fleets. We will be ready. They will try to crush us. We will survive. Because that is what we do. That is what we have always done. She looked up at the stars visible through the open roof of the Colosseum somewhere. Out there, Earth was spinning through space, completely unaware that one of its daughters had started a revolution. In its name, somewhere out there, fleets were being mobilized to destroy everything she had built. Somewhere out there, billions of people were hearing her words and deciding whether to believe them. Round 99, she said quietly, coming soon. But she was not afraid. She had never been afraid, not really, because fear was just another enemy to be faced and overcome. And she had been facing enemies and overcoming them since the day she was born on a planet that tried to kill its children every single day. The Dominion was powerful. that Earth had made her stronger, and this fight was just beginning.